All right, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the essay Climate Collective Action and Individual Ethical Obligations by Marion Hourdequin. There's four sections to this lecture. First, we'll talk about Johnson and Snow Armstrong, who Hourdequin is arguing against, these two authors. Then we're going to talk more about the tragedy of the commons, which Johnson uses to defend their view that we don't have a personal obligation to reduce our own individual impact. And then we're going to look at two different ways that Hourdequin defends the idea that we do have an individual obligation to reduce our own personal impact on climate change. One based on integrity. So, and first, Hourdequin is going to argue that on the basis of integrity, we have a moral obligation to reduce our personal impact if we care about climate change, and also going to then appeal to Confucian philosophy to say that if you see people in the way that this type of philosophy construes people, then we also have an obligation to think about our individual contribution and to make changes based on what we believe in. Okay, so starting with Johnson and Snow Armstrong, both argue against an individual obligation to reduce our climate impact. So they're both saying that as individuals, we have no obligation to make personal changes in our individual lives to reduce climate change. And they have different arguments to defend those views. Hourdequin's going to challenge both of those types of arguments. So let's start with Johnson. Johnson conceives of climate change as a collective action problem or a tragedy of the commons. We'll talk more about that in the next section, but the main point that Johnson makes is that climate change has the structure of a collective action problem. So it's a form of the tragedy of the commons. And for those problems, if the group hasn't reached an agreement together about what individuals should do and are required to do, then making a change only as an individual isn't going to solve the problem. And so it's not morally required. So in the absence of collective agreement, that is, when the group has not decided to limit individual contributions, then limiting your own individual contributions isn't going to make a difference. Okay, furthermore, for Johnson, if you have to sacrifice your own interests by reducing your emissions, for example, or controlling your own individual contribution to climate change, then it may even be unethical for you to do that. So it's not only that you lack the obligation to reduce your emissions and to exercise restraint in your own contribution to climate change, but it may even be unethical for you to do that if it works against your own interests and well-being in some way. So Johnson thus denounces the Kantian rationale for individuals acting to preserve a communal resource. So Johnson's rejecting Kant. Okay, so what does Kant say? Well, remember the categorical imperative deontology, this idea that some acts are either right or wrong, period. Well, the categorical imperative says, and this is Kantian rationale, we ought to act only according to maxims that it would be possible for everyone to follow. So when you act, you think of a rule that characterizes your action, and then you say, could everyone act in this way? If it's possible for everyone to do that, then the action is permissible. It's okay to do it. And if it's not possible for everyone to act in that way, then the action is wrong. So how does that apply to climate change? Well, a Kantian rationale for limiting your emissions would say that just contributing as much as you want, or if we're sticking with the model of a tragedy of the commons, just using up as many resources as you want without thinking about sustaining the resource for the collective is not possible for everyone, because if everyone acted that way and just used whatever resources they wanted, then the resources would be gone. We'd be out of all the stuff that we need to live. So the Kantian rationale for limiting your contributions is that if everyone acted in an unlimited way, if we just acted like there's unlimited earth to exploit and we can do whatever we want to the atmosphere, then we'd have no atmosphere to live in. We'd have no resources to survive. We'd use up all our resources. So The Kantian idea is that we can't exploit a communal resource because it would not be possible for everyone to do that. The resource would be depleted. And Kant's reasoning for that is that we're rational. And so if we think that we can do that, even though not everyone else could do it together, then we're making an exception for ourselves, and that's irrational. Okay, so that's the Kantian view of why, an interpretation of why Kant might say... It's okay. Okay. That's a mistake. All right, so Johnson is saying Kant would say that we shouldn't use as many resources as we want or contribute whatever we want to climate change without thinking about the collective, because not everyone could act in that way. Johnson is saying that's not a good reason to control your emissions or to, act to reduce your own contribution to climate change, because that idea ignores that we don't have in place a collective agreement that everyone's going to act responsibly in that way. So if everyone is doing whatever they want, then what you do is not going to make a difference ultimately. And even though that method of acting is unsustainable, not everyone could do it. If there's no collective agreement to not behave in that way, then your individual contribution is not going to be the reason that the resource is depleted, right? The resource is going to get depleted no matter what if there's no agreement among the whole collective to limit our emissions. Okay, so Johnson is saying the Kantian rationale doesn't provide a reason to limit our emissions because it fails to distinguish between our own individual actions when there's a broader agreement among the community that we're a part of, or the society or the global community that we're a part of, when there's an agreement there and when there's not an agreement there. And if there's an agreement collectively about what each individual is going to do, then yeah, it makes sense to control your emissions because you're part of that agreement, and having that agreement in place is going to make sure that the resource remains usable, or our use is sustainable. But if there's no such agreement, then what you do as an individual is not going to make a difference to whether the resource gets depleted or not. Okay, bring me my backpack. Okay, so that's Johnson's response to Kant. So that's a lot to take in, and I encourage you to review this part of the video until you understand it, and then try to explain it to someone. Okay, but the take-home message is that in the absence of a collective agreement, of a broader agreement that we're all going to behave in this way by reducing our impact, then reducing your impact by yourself isn't going to solve the problem. Getting headphones for the tablet. All right.
What kind of this thing?
Gotta find it. All right, so like Johnson, Snow Armstrong argues against an individual's obligation to reduce emissions. So Johnson and Snow Armstrong are both saying that as individuals, we have no obligation to respond to climate change, to be careful about how we contribute, to have environmentally sustainable practices as individuals. Okay, Snow Armstrong's strategy is different from Johnson's. Snow Armstrong considers all these principles, like a dozen of them, or close to that, that might support the idea.
These headphones are bad. Bad headphones.
Are you making any sound? Okay.
Is it on the... this one keeps falling out.
Oh, you gotta hold them in. All right, so like Johnson, Snow Armstrong is claiming that we have no obligation as individuals to reduce our impact. Okay, they both agree about that. That's what Hourdequin is going to respond to and critique. So Armstrong was saying we don't have that obligation because climate change is a tragedy of the commons. And facts about tragedy of the commons means that if there's no agreement among the commons for individuals to reduce their emissions, like if there's no law that we've agreed to, like we've created and implemented as a society that says individuals have to reduce their emissions, then reducing emissions by yourself is not going to make a difference. Okay, so that's Johnson's argument, that we don't have an obligation to reduce our emissions because climate change has the structure of a tragedy of the commons. Snow Armstrong is going to offer a different reason that we are not obligated to reduce our emissions. And that strategy, Snow Armstrong's strategy, is to offer up all these principles to say, here's an idea of why we might be required to reduce our emissions, but that doesn't work to lead to that. That doesn't lead to that conclusion. That any of these principles that Snow Armstrong considers are not going to have the implication that we should reduce our emissions for various reasons. And that's a long and winding route that Snow Armstrong takes to get to the conclusion that we don't have the obligation to reduce our emission. But the main point is, by most of the attention focuses on the idea of harm. And Snow Armstrong's main point is that what you do to contribute to climate change, whether you drive an SUV for fun on Sundays or take flights across the ocean frivolously for no reason, just to because you like to be in an airplane, whether you make these frivolous, huge contributions to climate change, doesn't harm anyone because the overall impact is so small when you compare the size of the problem altogether, that as an individual you don't have an obligation to reduce your emissions, just because what you do is not going to have cause direct harm for any other person. Okay, because it's such a small part of a huge problem that it doesn't matter. Okay, so now let's look more closely at the tragedy of the commons. So tragedy of the commons is an idea popularized by Garrett Hardin in 1968.
What's this say?
And it's a scenario, I can't help you right now. It's a scenario in which individuals have an incentive to exploit a shared resource, although exploitation of the shared resource by the group has a negative impact on everyone. Okay, so if you exploit the resource by yourself, you gain from that exploitation. You get more of the resource than other people who aren't exploiting the resource. But if everyone works together to restrain their use of the resource, then we'll be able to keep using the resource. But if enough people exploit the resource, then the resource goes away for everyone and everyone loses. Okay, so if everyone just takes as much as they want, then the whole group loses because eventually you run out of the resource. If everyone just takes a little bit, then everyone benefits a little because you can sustain the resource and keep getting what you need from it indefinitely, sustainably. But if only some people take as much as they want and other people exercise restraint, then the people who take as much as they want are going to do better off by getting more of the resource. And the people who exercise restraint are going to lose because they're not taking as much as the resource, and the resource is still going to be depleted anyway because enough people are exploiting it that the group doesn't stand a chance of sustaining the resource. Okay, so there are three assumptions that Hourdequin cites as characterizing this idea of a tragedy of the commons. One is that costs of increased use are shared, but benefits from increased use accrue to the individual. Okay, so that's this idea that if you take as much as you want, then you're going to get benefits from using as much as you want. But the cost of everyone using as much as they want, or a large enough group using as much as they want, is going to impact everyone, which is that the resource goes away and then we all lose ultimately. Another assumption is that benefits of reducing your use are shared, but cost of reducing your use are borne by the individual. So if enough people reduce their use, then everyone wins because the resource is sustained long term. But if when you reduce your use, you get less than you otherwise would if you just exploited the resource. And the final consideration or assumption is that resources saved by one individual are available for use by another. So if you restrain your use, if you don't take as much fish from the ocean and there are more fish available for others, then other people are just going to take those fish and the resource is still going to get depleted ultimately. So you have an incentive to use as much as you want, because if you don't, other people are going to use that and everyone's going to lose anyway, because people are just going to act in this unrestrained way ultimately, and the resource will go away. That's the tragedy. Okay, so here's the example, which I just alluded to. Overfishing. If everyone takes as much fish as they want, the fish population will be reduced to unsustainable levels and everyone will lose. You have to go away if I'm too loud. If everyone exercises restraint and doesn't fish as much as they want, just takes a few fish now and then we can practice fishing sustainably. Everyone wins because we get to fish into our futures and our children will have fish to eat too. But if only some people exercise restraint and others take as much as they want, then the people who exercise restraint get fewer fish, they lose, and the people who take as much as they want get more fish, they end up the winners, and the resource is going away anyway because people can't control themselves and always are going to act in their self-interest. So other people are just going to exploit the resource if you don't, and so you might as well exploit it yourself to get in on the fish while you can. That's the tragedy of the commons, and that's the way that climate change is framed by Johnson, at least. Okay, so climate change is a tragedy of the commons, according to Johnson, or a collective action problem, another term for the same idea. In the sense of in the absence of a group agreement, individual actions won't solve the problem. So for Johnson, if the group got together and said, look, we, like the global community, the global population said, look, we all need to do our part to reduce climate change, and so we're going to make laws that you can't pollute, or you can't contribute this much CO2 to the atmosphere, etc. If the group got together and made that agreement, then it would make sense for me to control my emissions. But in the absence of that agreement, if no one's saying that everyone has to control their emissions, then it's in my interest to take as much as I want, to exploit the environment, contribute as much as I want, because then I get to fly far away for vacation and eat vegetables from overseas and all that stuff that contributes to climate change. So you get to do all that, which makes your life better. Okay, so in the absence of a group agreement, individual actions won't solve the problem, so you don't have a reason to reduce your own contribution to the problem, because it doesn't make a difference if everyone else is just going to still contribute to climate change as much as they want. Okay, so that's the setting. Those are the arguments that Hourdequin is going to argue against. Okay, so Johnson and Snow Armstrong. So again, Johnson is saying, let me back up here. So Johnson is saying that that climate change is a tragedy of the commons problem. It has the structure of that kind of scenario where every individual has an incentive to contribute as much as they want, and it's fine for them to do so, because in the absence of a communal agreement about reducing our impact, then whether you use as much as you want or restrain your own resource consumption is not going to make a difference to whether there's climate change or not. It's not going to make any difference whatsoever. And so you should just go on using as much as you want, because in the meantime, you can still go skiing and eat meat and all that stuff that makes people like in their lives. Okay. So what is Hourdequin's strategy for responding to these? Well, Hourdequin has two separate strategies. One is to use this notion of integrity to argue for an individual obligation to reduce our impact. And the other is to use Confucian philosophy to argue for an obligation to reduce our individual impact. So again, Johnson and Snow Armstrong are saying we have no obligation to reduce our individual impact on climate change or to reduce our own individual emissions. Hourdequin is saying, actually, we do have that obligation, and here's why. So the first reason is this notion of integrity. So Hourdequin points out that Johnson and Snow Armstrong both agree that we have a moral obligation to combat climate change. Okay, so they both say, look, what you do as an individual in your personal life doesn't matter, but you should still take steps to change the collective, right? To change policy, to elect representatives who will work to mitigate climate change, to advocate for laws and policy changes that will affect climate change, we have an obligation still to work towards a solution, but it doesn't involve not driving an SUV for fun on a Sunday, right? It's just about political action or activism at a larger scale. Hourdequin says that if you agree that we have a general obligation to combat climate change, and you're a person and you are a person of integrity, that means that you're going to recognize a moral obligation to reduce your individual impact. So when you combine this idea that we have a moral obligation to combat climate change, to work for social change at the societal level, and integrity, so the idea that we ought to combat climate change societally and integrity entails that we should work towards those changes in our personal lives. Okay, so according to Hourdequin, believing that we have an obligation to combat climate change at a societal level and not enacting that in your personal life is a kind of hypocrisy. And avoiding that hypocrisy means that you have to reconcile your personal obligation, how you are in your individual life and what your personal contribution is, with your political commitments, your beliefs about what we ought to do as a society. There should be a kind of harmony or unity there between those values in different realms. Okay, so now they're going to say more about what integrity is. So integrity for them is about integrality and integration, two separate ideas that form a unified notion of integrity. So integrality, or being integral, means internalizing your commitments or making your commitments part of your identity. So really holding that value close as a part of who you are. If you believe that we ought to combat climate change, then combating climate change becomes integral. If you act with integrity, it becomes an integral part of how you see yourself and your worldview, and who you are is someone who values that, recognizes that climate change is a problem and values trying to solve that problem and reduce the severity of the problem. Okay, that's the part of being integral. Integration means that your values as a whole kind of fit together. They harmonize or are unified in a certain way. That means that you can't value one thing over here and not value it over here. If you're acting with integrity, these things are integrated. And if you have a core value that's really integral to who you are, then you're going to embody that value in different realms of your life. Someone who is truly concerned about climate change is going to integrate their personal and political values and actions. Their personal efforts to alleviate climate change are going to align with their political efforts. So integrity requires that our commitments exhibit a kind of unity at the personal and political level. So what you do in your own life, what kind of car you drive, what kind of house you live in, and where you keep the thermostat, all these things which impact climate change, or which use or don't use fossil fuels, or require more or less use of fossil fuels. All those things about our personal lives are going to cohere with what we believe at a political level and a societal level. It's going to sort of affirm that kind of change that we want to see societally, what we do in our personal lives, if we're acting with integrity. Okay, so Hourdequin now addresses consequentialism. So think back again to moral theory. The idea of consequentialism is that what matters is the good that comes from our actions. And especially Sano Armstrong was saying that it doesn't matter what we do individually because of the consequences, because the consequences are so minuscule, they don't make a difference to the overall harm or benefit to others, and so it doesn't matter. But Hourdequin is saying that that kind of view ignores what they call the wholeness of persons, this idea that integrity requires us to harmonize our different values and to act as a unified agent where our values are working together. And so we ought to reduce our individual emissions, even if the consequences are irrelevant or neutral with respect to the environment, even if it has no material impact. So even if no one is affected by our personal choices, being a person of integrity means that your personal choices are going to reflect your political values and commitments. And if the only thing you care about, like Johnson is arguing, Sano Armstrong is arguing, is the consequences of those behaviors, then you're forgetting what it means to be a person of integrity, forgetting this idea that integrity requires a kind of unity or wholeness of our values synchronized into one whole. Okay, but also, Hourdequin says, I'm not against consequentialism all the time, and it does offer important moral considerations a lot of the time, even though those arguments based on consequentialist reasoning miss something important about integrity. We can also use consequentialist reasoning to support this idea of integrity, because acting with integrity has good consequences. So it has good consequences both intrapersonally, that's like between different people, and it has intrapersonally within a single person, it has good consequences. And when we think about our connections with others, it also has good consequences. So intrapersonally, the good consequence of integrity is that it makes acting easier. It makes it easier to be an actor, to be an agent, when your beliefs, values, and actions are integrated into one coherent whole. So if you're not like divided and split on where you see, that acting to reduce climate change is important or not, if whether it's important varies significantly between different realms of your life, it's just going to be sort of split mind. It's just going to be confusing to be an agent. It's easier to act in a way that affirms your values when those values are synchronized and when all of your commitments sort of form together this kind of coherent whole that you can believe in. Interpersonally, integrity has good consequences because it allows us to demonstrate our commitments to others. So being a person of integrity allows people to know what you care about and what you value based on your actions. Okay, and when you act with integrity, then people can perceive that you are authentic in your values, that you're not just saying that you value reducing climate change when your personal behaviors don't affirm that value. Okay, so it's better for us individually and intrapersonally within our own character, and it's also better for us as we try to work together with others to be people who act on the basis of integrity. Okay, so this is my favorite slide, because Hourdequin is pointing out that this is taking things one step further, because even political action, like going to a protest to change a government policy, you as an individual are not going to change that policy by yourself. So at the individual level, what Johnson and Snow Armstrong are calling political action, like individual efforts to change political circumstances, like society, to change society or broader collective changes, when you act as an individual to do that, you're not likely to have an impact there either, all by yourself, if you only consider your own contributions. If you're deciding whether to go to a protest or stay home, the protest is going to happen with or without you. So it doesn't really matter, in one sense, whether you go or not. In fact, standing up for causes you care about, I mean, I just went to a demonstration in the rain to support teachers. I didn't want to go. I was tired. It was raining. I had to leave the house. It was late. It was bedtime. All these things. It may even make life worse for the activists. So being part of a political solution or making an effort to change politics or change government policy or things like that are not always in your interest as an individual, but it may still be something that's morally admirable since it demonstrates integrity. So Hourdequin cites another author who says the activist's life loses meaning if she fails to act against an unjust policy. So standing up for what you believe in may be an important part of who you are, even if you standing up is not going to make any material difference. That's the idea, is that your life has more meaning to you, and integrity is still a value, even if the particular actions that stem from acting with integrity are not going to make a difference in terms of consequences that is perceptible, not going to make any kind of difference. Because whether you vote also, I mean, your vote is not going to change an election, right? No election is going to come down to one vote, but it may still be important to you, and I hope it is, especially in this moment, to exercise your right to vote, to choose your representatives, because how we get the society we want is by all of us, enough of us, participating in those decisions. So likewise, being the kind of person who cares about climate change means being the kind of person who's thoughtful about one's individual emissions. So there's a parallel here, which is that not driving for fun on a Sunday is one way to express your commitment to climate change, and showing up at a protest is maybe one way to express your commitment to climate change. And both of those actions by themselves are not going to change the world and may have no impact whatsoever on the world as a whole. Just because of you as an individual doing that thing, if you stay home from the protest, it's still going to happen without you and probably have the same impact with or without you as an individual. But it's sort of part of living a cohesive life where your values align with your actions and your values and commitments harmonize with each other, that if you're a person who's professing to care about this stuff, then you take those actions to care about them. And actions can be political, even if they're not attempts to change society. They can have broader societal implications. And so that's what Hourdequin is going to mention in the next section when they talk about Confucianism. And also this individual versus political divide is not really the right way to think about things, because an individual action can have political implications, just acting as one individual, just like reducing your emissions by not driving, by what kind of car you drive, and also showing up at the protest. Those can both be political actions because they can change society, and we act as part of a society. And so the difference between political and personal is not just like whether you're trying to create change at a larger level than just what you're doing yourself or what your goal is. So the individual action can have personal consequences in your own life, like going to a demonstration in the rain at bedtime might make the next day harder because your kid will be tired, but it also may have important societal implications because you're participating in efforts to change a policy. The same with driving your SUV for fun on a Sunday. It has personal consequences, but it can also have broader societal implications because we're part of a community, and that's the point we're going to get to next. Okay, so Confucianism. Take some time with this last slide and think about this divide between personal and political, and how Hourdequin is saying that Johnson and Snow Armstrong miss the point or misconceive of what that distinction is and how they pull those things apart. Try to explain it to someone. Okay, so recall the structure of collective action problems, or tragedy of the commons. So think back to what we said about that. So we said they make problematic assumptions. Well, one of those assumptions is that humans are rational agents who always seek to maximize their personal advantage and who don't influence one another's decisions. That's a few assumptions, actually. But the idea is Hourdequin's point is to explain, make explicit how tragedy of the commons scenarios are construing humans, individual persons, how they think of what a person is. And those problems assume that a person is someone who's always going to act to do whatever is in their own interest, that's always their preference. They're always going to try to maximize that to get as much as they can to their personal advantage, right? To maximize their own interests or how much their interests are being met. And they're making decisions in isolation from other members of the community. So that's why this idea, if I take less, others are just going to take more, assumes that we're not like talking about our use and coming, figuring out how we can work together. We're just making our decisions without knowing what other people are going to do, and also assuming that they're also going to maximize their own personal interest when they're able to. So that's the assumptions, that the framework, that's how the notion of a collective action problem frames human psychology, how they think of what people are and how they're going to act. They also assume that if you hold back on what you take from the environment or what you contribute negatively to the environment, if you restrain your own contribution to climate change, then others are going to exploit whatever you leave behind. So if you take fewer fish from the ocean, then others are going to take those fish anyway. The population is still going to decline to the point that it's unsustainable, and eventually no one gets to eat fish. Okay, so the assumption is that if I don't take as much as I can, then somebody else is going to take that anyway. Okay, that's why Johnson thought that for collective action problems, acting as an individual when there's no group agreement to reduce our emissions or to sustain the resource for the collective, when there's no agreement to do that, making that choice as an individual is morally impotent. It's not going to have any impact on whether the resource is actually sustained for the collective. Okay, and that's why Johnson thinks that we don't have an obligation to limit our individual emissions. Confucianism is going to challenge this whole picture of what it means to be a human and how humans act and how we relate to one another. So according to Confucianism, humans are not essentially isolated rational actors like the tragedy of the commons sets us up to believe we are. Okay? Humans instead are constituted by and through their relationships with others. Now think about what other moral theories have this kind of perspective that we've already talked about, where the relationship is what is central and individualism is rejected. Okay, this idea that we act as individuals in isolation from others, and that's essentially what we are, is like a single unit, like a chess piece or something. Instead, who we are is constituted by how we relate to one another, by who we are in a web of relationships. Okay, so a first important point to make as what comes out of a relational view of human nature is that we develop our moral values as part of a moral community. So we don't make moral decisions in isolation from other people and without being influenced by other people. Instead, our very outlook, our moral outlook, what we come to value and our deepest commitments are already shaped by our communities, okay? And our actions within those communities are interpreted, they're symbolic. People judge us for what we do, and they're not just materially significant or not. That the harms or benefits that result from our choices are not the only significant part of them for having an impact. Okay, a second point is that Confucius believed we learn virtues from one another. Okay, so because we're constituted through our relationships, one feature of those relationships is that we learn from each other. We view some people as role models. We view other people as people we don't want to be like. And that shapes our values and it shapes our actions. Ultimately, we emulate others that we admire. So moral models have magnetic power, and virtuous individuals can affect moral reform through their actions by inspiring others. So what we do and the choices we make are not just important for us alone or for the direct consequences of those choices. We make choices as part of a community, and we're always seeing and observing the choices that others have. And that's why rock stars can rise to fame in weeks or months, right? From nothing, because who people like is affected by our peers and what other people in our communities think is important, for example. And that's why you can witness a whole sea change where something becomes popular one moment and then is not popular the next moment, is because our decisions affect other people's decisions. We have an impact on what other people take to be worthwhile or valuable. All our decisions are interconnected as part of the broader communities that we comprise. Okay, so Confucian philosophy offers an important alternative framework and a conception of persons that offers a way out of collective action problems. So when people conceive of themselves relationally, individual actions can be seen to catalyze emerging collective agreements. So again, look at that word emerging, right? Think of Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown, this idea that how we are in our communities and our daily lives is what results in these larger social patterns that we embody at a societal level. All of that comes down to how we behave in our daily lives. It's a mirror of itself. I mean, that's the idea of fractals, right? That what we do at a smaller scale resembles what happens at the larger scale, that these things align. And so if we act in one way, that can change our community, that can change our family, our roommate suite even, and those changes can be seen when we take a bigger picture.
And am I gonna be done?
Almost. Okay, so instead of merely providing an opportunity for others to take advantage, when we exercise restraint as individuals, we may actually inspire collective change. So it's not just that what we do is only going to make a difference with who it directly impacts and nobody else is observing our choice. Instead, we're making choices as part of a collective, and that choice making has an impact on others. We're being observed by people in our community when we make those choices, and people are all the time forming opinions and shaping their values and deciding what kind of people they're going to be and acting accordingly. Okay, so Hardin, this is about coercion. So Hardin, who popularized the notion of tragedy of the commons in 1968, sees government coercion, and that by that he means large-scale regulations, incentives, rewards, and punishments for different behaviors, basically enacted and implemented by the government, as the only way to create solutions to problems such as climate change. So the only way that we're going to get out of this mess, according to Hardin, is if we have changes at a governmental level that incentivize actions to reduce climate change. So people can still act in their own self-interest and have a reason to reduce their emissions if the government has made a law that says you get a tax break if you drive this kind of car or whatever. Okay? Confucian philosophy is going to reject coercion as a strategy for genuine transformation. They're going to say what the government does to try to change our behaviors is only going to be part of the solution to really solving our problems, our global problems of how we relate to the earth, because any reform that's only achieved through coercion is going to be shallow and unstable. We also need to change people's minds and values, how people actually think and feel about climate change. In Ada Leopold's words, what we need is a broadened sense of responsibility or an ecological conscience. So we have to change our values. Think of Ishmael again. We have to change the story that we're telling ourselves, the myths we accept, and how we form our culture and our cultural values. That's what needs to shift on this perspective. We don't need to see ourselves as isolated rational actors whose preferences are entirely self-interested and independent of their social consequences and the values of others. Okay, so we don't need to view ourselves in that way. We can take this other view of what human nature is and what it means to be a human and see ourselves as inherently interconnected with other humans, inherently part of a moral community, as relational creatures. Within that picture, our actions have social meaning, and within our communities, we communicate our values through the choices we make, and we respond to the choices of others by admiring, emulating, criticizing, reprimanding, etc. So we shape our moral selves through our relationships with others, and we learn what we value, and we learn what we want to emulate, and what kind of people we want to be by making choices together and noticing the choices of others. I might have to start over if you keep doing that, okay? So you have to just wait a little longer. Go do something else. Go draw me a picture. Okay, well. All right, so how we view ourselves shapes how we believe we ought to act. So whether we adopt this conception of ourselves as isolated rational creatures who always act to maximize our self-interest, or whether we see ourselves as inherently relational beings whose values are shaped by the collective and who care about the outcomes for the collective and are capable of acting in ways to preserve the resources for the collective, is going to affect how we think we ought to act and then how we act. So which picture we take of human nature is going to affect how we behave. And in that sense, our conceptual frameworks are normative. They have implications for how we believe we ought to act. And we have normative reasons then to adopt one framework over another. So we're not just thinking of a correct description of what actually is going the case is the case, but when we decide which conceptual framework to adopt, how we essentially view human beings, we're making a normative choice about which framework is better for achieving the goals that we have together. That's another sense in which our conceptual frameworks are normative. So they have normative implications for what we ought to do, and they also are normative in the sense that which framework is correct depends partially on what our goals are and what kind of society we want to build. Okay, and Hourdequin also cites evidence that many of us do see ourselves in this relational way. Okay, so they've collected data about how people think about what choice of which car to drive and how people judge people who drive different cars depending on how much gas they use up. So the idea is that we see people's choices as having a moral meaning. We interpret people's choices as representing their values, and we engage in community in the ways that Confucians see us as describing. Okay. Furthermore, a critical mass of people who think it's wrong to go for joyrides in SUVs on the weekend can develop the momentum to shift other people's values and views about that question. So just like, again, there's a tipping point when a certain rock star rises to fame, right? Where they go from relative obscurity into everyone knowing who they are. At some point, enough people like them that they shift the general population's perception of that rock star. And so, again, this all just involves viewing people as related to one another and looking for ways that actions and values shift collectively, paying attention to the collective and not just to us as individuals. And furthermore, what we do in our personal lives, like if you put solar panels on your house or buy a fuel-efficient car, that can also change your own commitments within you to your relationship to broader societal changes and political change. Not yet. So, two things here is that one is that enough individuals who care about something can get other people to care about it too in their society, and also that caring about a personal action, like something that just involves you and your house, can also inspire you to care about more broader political actions like advocating for legislation promoting alternative energy. I see it. All right, so the last slide, this is the end. The take-home message is that what you do as an individual can change your society.
No.
And we have personal obligations to reduce our own emissions. Please stop.
Why? Done?
No. We have personal obligations to reduce our own emissions and also an obligation to seek larger scale social transformation.